Hi, everyone. My name's Alex Camlin, and on behalf of Society of Printers, I want to welcome you to what will be our final online presentation for this series. The Society of Printers was formed in 1905 by Boston-based designers, typographers, printers, and other proponents of the arts and crafts movement in printing and the book arts. We meet monthly from October to May for a dinner followed by presentations by respected experts and luminaries from the many disciplines of our concern, including literate design, printing history, typography, and more. While we had to dine apart from one another this year, we have been able to continue our programming and share it with the public, which has included presentations from guests such as the Hamilton Woodtype Museum, Saki Mafundikwa, John T. Hill, Irma Boom, and Stephen Heller, to name a few. All of these have been recorded and are available for viewing on our YouTube channel. If you're interested in learning more about the Society or making a donation to support this programming, you can visit our website or contact our governing council at secretary@societyofprinters.org. Our guest tonight is Lance Hidy, who is a graphic artist and educator who specializes in the design of posters, photography, books, and corporate branding. He's also designed 3 US postage stamps, and he created the Penumbra typeface family for Adobe. After being chosen by Ansel Adams to design the landmark book Yosemite in the Range of Light, which was published in 1979, Heidi has continued to design the official books for the Ansel Adams Publishing Rights Trust and Little Brown and Company publishers. His writing on design has been widely published in books and journals, and he's also a longtime member of the Society of Printers here in Boston. I'm asking that the audience members remain on mute during tonight's talk and enter any questions you have for Lance in Zoom's chat feature, which will be answered at the conclusion of tonight's presentation. And with that, please join me in welcoming Lance Hidy as I turn things over to him for tonight's presentation.
Thank you, Alex. And hello, everybody. I know that a lot of you who are watching are friends of mine, and I'm trying to get into the mental state of thinking that you are right here with me in my home, and we're just talking. I have given a lot of lectures about Ansel Adams, but it was more about him and his work as an environmentalist and a photographer, and I had a written text that I would use with it. But this is very different. I'm going to be just talking about my experience working with Ansel, designing a book, and what followed after that. Talking with some friends, including Sandra Klimt, who has been the wonderful production coordinator for the books that we have worked on over the decades. She was encouraging me to tell the story of what it was like working with Ansel, and other people have also. And the result of it is this slideshow, and I'm really grateful to the Society of Printers for hosting it. So Yosemite in the Range of Light made a big splash when it was published in September of 1979. It not only got Ansel on the cover of Time magazine, but there was a major exhibition of Ansel Adams and the West, organized by John Sherkowski at the Museum of Modern Art. And it also had a big article in Publishers Weekly, which I'll be talking about. It made a huge publicity splash with all of this attention. Whoops, sorry. It was following the book Images that came out 5 years earlier, in 1974. And it's just interesting to note that when Images was published, it was at $65 for the Christmas holiday season. But Yosemite in the Range of Light was issued at $75, which according to inflation calculators is the equivalent of $273 today. It was only 15 inches wide, still a big book. So how did it happen that I was chosen to be the designer for this book? And it's a question which I could not really answer fully. I think that some of the reasons were, one, I was giving lectures on the history of the photographic book. The first one was at the George Eastman House, and gave them in several other places, including the Steinauer Press. And this invitation on the left was designed by Stephen Harvard, the art director at the Steinauer Press. I'd also designed Arnold Newman's first book, The One Mind's Eye, that was published by David Godine, where I was working as the art director. Arnold and I became good friends, and I know that he also was a friend of Ansel's, as you'll see in a moment. Another possible reason why they chose me was I had designed the American Monument, photographs of Lee Friedlander for the Akins Press Foundation. It was amusing when Ansel was writing me at the beginning, before I'd even met him, he had this to say about Lee Friedlander. I am a very big fan of Lee Friedlander's, and I always was, and was really excited to work on this book. But this was Ansel's thought. You know, he was impressed that I had done the book, but he said that he's perplexed over Lee Friedlander's photography. This is just one page from the book. It was only printed on right-hand pages, not on the backs. And here's the cover of One Mind's Eye, the book I did with Arnold Newman. And the typeface in it was Optima, as you see here. One of the things of this book that might have gotten the attraction of Ansel, and certainly did of other people, was that I had been so impressed when I worked with Arnold at a studio, and he was showing me his proof sheets, contact sheets. I was so interested to see not only how all the different shots that he had discarded, and then how he cropped the final shot. And I said to Arnold, we have to put this in the book. People will love it. And his gallery, the Light Gallery in Manhattan, liked this so much that they had an exhibition of photographs that leading photographers were known for, and they had to also exhibit the discarded images from that shoot. So that was a spin-off from this experiment. So Alan Ross kindly shared with me some of the photographs that he had made when Arnold Newman came to Carmel to photograph Ansel in 1977. This was not an assignment. It was part of Arnold's ongoing passion for photographing artists. Here's the finished photograph. Lots of reflections from his glasses and on the big glass doors. And Alan took some photographs of Ansel telling Arnold a joke. And because both of these men were friends of mine, I love this and the next one, seeing them cracking up. So this was the first letter that I received from Ansel in March of 1978. You know, he had the idea that I was going to come out and stay there for a week in Carmel, and we would finish the selection and sequencing. He liked the portfolio of work that I had sent him. He called me on the phone to give me instructions on how to get to his place, and I wrote them on the back of one of his letters, and that's what this is. And I like that 1/10 of a mile in. It was exactly, you know, it was measured perfectly. I had no trouble finding the house. And I was with my wife, Carolyn Coleman, who ended up being a big part of the book, as you'll see in some later slides. Ansel and Virginia had kindly invited Carolyn to come along. So this was their living room, and this was a photograph taken by Alan 3 years before I arrived there, but it looked pretty much like this when I was there. So here is the detail from Arnold Newman's portrait of Ansel. And I've been remembering when I was so warmly greeted, both my wife and I were greeted by Ansel and Virginia. They showed us around, they showed us the guest bedroom, which housed a lot of the treasures from Virginia's collection of baskets made by indigenous Americans. And he played the piano a little bit, and after all the formalities were done, he looked at me. Here, I was 44 years younger than he is. I was 32 years old. He was 76. And he looked at me and he said, my doctors told me that I can't work on the sequencing of the book. He said, I have sequenced every book I've ever done. I've sequenced every exhibition I've ever put together. And because I'm going to have open heart surgery right after the book is published, my doctors have forbid me from doing certain things, including the sequencing the book. So he said, Lance, you're going to have to do this for me. And then he looked me right in the eye, and he says, young man, how are you going to do this? So I had given it a little bit of thought. And I said, Ansel, I was thinking about doing it as though the book were a musical composition, like a suite or even a symphony. And we start off with an overture that would state some of the main themes that would follow in the rest of the book. And then as we flow through the pages, try and set a mood for several spreads and then change the mood to something else. But have it, think of it as a musical composition. And he smiled and he said, I like that idea. He said, let's do that. Whoops, my apologies. I won't let that happen again. So here's the book. This is our musical composition. This is every spread that has photographs on it. And up at the top here, you see the spreads that have a dark background. That is what I thought of as the overture, where we stated the main themes. And the rest of the book shows you that we did not have very many blank pages. I think there were just 3. And so I'm going to show you some of the spreads that Ansel and I worked on. He really loved the pairings that I made, and he kind of, even though the doctors had told him not to do it, he kind of got into the spirit of it and made some suggestions too. But when I was reading the Publisher's Weekly article about this book just yesterday, I saw this line, which I had forgotten. That 87 of the pictures in the book had never before appeared in one of Ansel's books. And this was not something that was conscious. It was not part of the plan. It just happened. When I arrived there, Ansel said, there are only going to be 100 photographs in the book. And so he said, we have about a pile of 200 work prints that we can select those from. I went over and I counted this pile of work prints, and there were really closer to 300 prints in it, which meant that we had a lot to choose from. His assistant, Andrea Turnage, at the time, Andrea Stillman now, said that Ansel had kept going over to his filing cabinets and pulling out more and more work prints to add to the pile, his favorite images. Well, the cover image was not my decision. This was a decision made by Tim Hill, the wonderful editor of the book, and conversations with Ansel and Bill Turnage. And I was fine with this. We couldn't do any better than that. So we used it both on the cover and on the title page. But in the overture, where we have these themes, the first one is just one of the grand sentimental Yosemite Valley scenes. Next, we have forests with backlight, then clouds, also backlit, and then abstractions, of which there are quite a few, photographs that are more abstraction than scenery. Waterfalls, tree portraits, details of trees, cliffs and mist, distant mountain scenery, snow, rocks, meadows with quiet water, and Half Dome, which was one of the motifs that appeared 8 times in the book. So that was the overtures, telling everybody, all the readers, what they were in for. So this is typical of the kind of pairings that we were looking for, that I was looking for. And it is to find images that had something that's very similar, but also which was very contrasting. So obviously here we have a similar composition, but there's V shape and the the grain of the wood flowing with this V-shaped or Y-shaped waterfall scene. Yet the wood is quite still and the water is quite active. So there's a lot of contrast here, yet there is a kind of a visual rhyme. Here are two cliff faces. One that has mist, a form of water, another that has ice, another form of water, moving on to water that is falling and water that is still. And here the visual rhyme that we like is that triangle of the tree at the bottom left of the left-hand page and the design and the reflection in the water, creating a similarity, a compositional similarity, yet active water compared to still water. This one has little, this little, on the right-hand page, you have the distant mountain, this little peak, and in the foreground, these two trees, one dead, one alive, vertical plant forms. And on the left, there are lots of vertical platforms, but they're little blades of grass, and there are peaks. There's an upside down mountain peak reflected in the water and the peak of this rock in the foreground. So there are little echoes and rhymes in between the two images, but also very contrasting. Here, the clouds, the same thing in both photographs. The shade on the distant landscape and the shade on the rock. Here there was a similarity in the light on the distant mountains and the light on the upper side of the water in this waterfall in the stream. Active and still compared. This is more abstract. We have these two stripes, a vertical stripe in the one on the left and a horizontal stripe that curves into the distance in the photograph on the right. Here's a great convex form on the left and a great concave form in the distance. These two photographs almost seem identical, except one is a distant Yosemite Valley scene and the other one is a close-up of tree bark. But the tonalities and the compositions are almost the same. Here we have patterns and reflections on the water. The reflection of Half Dome on the left is kind of echoed by this boulder, and you have these ripples of foam. Again, the ripples of foam, and on the right, this swirling clouds around Half Dome, swirling just like the foam. So here is a kind of otherworldly, stark, almost lifeless landscape of this dead tree on the left, and this kind of moonscape on the right, just rocks, but there is the moon up in the sky, setting a different mood, a more desolate mood. Here, in a way, these are portraits of elements in the landscape, a tree and a triangle-shaped mountain in Kings Canyon National Park. Each one a portrait of part of the park, but also very different, contrasting. Snow, both have snow. Very different compositions, same subject. Here we have the vertical shapes coming down in the distant mountain, but also these vertical shapes of water. And down in the lower center of both photographs is a kind of a dark circle, a kind of compositional echo. Here are two portraits, a portrait of a rock on the left with grass in the foreground and a portrait of a tree on the right with rocks in the foreground, similar yet different. And here we have the dark shapes of the trees looking very similar to the shapes, the dark shapes on the rock surface on the right. Similar tonality, similar compositions, very different subjects. This photograph got a page, a spread to itself. Here we have the craggy tree on the right, tapering upward, looking very active, even though it's motionless. And on the left, tapering upward, is the waterfall. So there's a compositional element between the two. And even the shape of the rainbow in the photograph on the left echoes the shape of the sloping hill in the lower part of the photograph. Here we have horizons. The one on the right is an upside down horizon reflected in the water. Tree details. Dry, dead tree stump on the left with snow on the pines on the right. Here, the way the light is creating shadows on the ridges and the rocks on the left is very similar to the light on this tree stump on the right. It's different scale. Two views of rocks. Contrast between the clouds on the left that look almost like they're volcanic against the stillness of the sky and the moon on the right. And this was the last photograph in the book. There's a little flourish. Ansel said it reminded him of the flourish on John Hancock's signature on the Declaration of Independence. He loved it as a final gesture on the last page. So I had forgotten, and I read the acknowledgments of the book the other day, and I was amazed that the first thing that he said in the acknowledgments was an appreciation of the sequencing. He gave me credit for it, but he definitely helped with it. And secondly, he thanks Andrea Turnage, now Andrea Stillman, who helped with the selection. And she was my advisor throughout the whole thing because there was a lot that I did not know about Ansel and his photographs. And she filled me in along the way and helped me understand some of the things that were important to Ansel that I could not have known without her help. So here is Andrea and Ansel. This is, I had a camera malfunction. This was the only photograph I got from that visit showing what the work prints look like. These were not exhibition prints. They were just work prints that we would use for the sequencing. I spread them out on the floor in their living room, and I took off my shoes and was stepping between the prints as though they, in my socks, so that I wouldn't dent them or harm them. So John Sexton sent me these two photographs. The one on the right, he was with Ansel in June of 1979 when Ansel got the first copy sent by express to Yosemite, where he was heading a workshop. And this was just a few months after his open heart surgery. So John said he was really excited and happy when he was looking through the book, and you can see the expression on his face. I wish I had been there to enjoy this moment with him. And here's a picture of Ansel with John Sexton. John, thank you very much for that. So there was more to the design of the book than the sequencing of the images. There was the titling, and there was the text. And the titles were all hand-lettered by Stephen Harvard, who I will tell you about in the slides ahead. This is all hand-lettered. It's done with a pen and with ink. He was a master graphic artist, book designer, brilliant stone carver. he was the one that did the lettering for this history of the photographic book announcement of the lecture that I was giving. It's a more playful kind of italic than the more formal one that he used on Yosemite and the Range of Light. Here's Steve. He died, he took his own life at age 40 in 1988. It was a devastating loss to his friends. On the right is a stone that he carved, an entire alphabet. I'm just showing a detail. It was a stone that he carved for Rocky Steinauer, the founder of the Steinauer Press. And this was photographed by Stephen Steinauer, Rocky's son, who has the stone right now. When Steve died, Dartmouth College, which was his alma mater, established the Stephen Harvard Memorial Lecture in the Book Arts, which has run every year since 1989. And the first year that it ran, it featured Matthew Carter, myself, and Sumner Stone as the speakers. This is the poster I designed for it on the left. 20 years later, we had a reunion event where Matthew and Sumner and I came back to look back and look forward at what has happened to typography. When we gave the first lecture in 1989, digital typography was barely getting started, and it was not looking very pretty at that moment. So it was fascinating. With both Matthew and Sumner were major players in the development of the digital typographic culture that we now all use. So I'm grateful to Dartmouth for memorializing Stephen Harvard, and this wonderful book art series that happens every year has been a great contribution. So here's some more of Stephen's lettering. This was at the bottom of the title page. The dedication. Title page for the foreword. Title of the foreword. So we had to decide what text face to use for the inside of the book, and after looking at a lot of possibilities, I settled on Saban, where you see a sample of the column on the left, and then a very much enlarged close-up of some of the words on the right. It's a very traditional typeface with serifs and tapered strokes, but also rather modest. It doesn't have a lot of details. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. The typefaces that have been used, or the main typeface that have been used on a lot of Ansel's book in the past is Centaur. Here you see here, it was used for the title of the Images book, which was designed by Adrian Wilson, who designed a number of Ansel's books. It was also used on the Sierra Club book, wonderful book that he did with Nancy Newhall. Centaur again. You see, Centaur has a lot of character. It's got a lot of distinctive details. Here's what it looks like when it's set as text. And I didn't really want to go in this direction. And besides that, well, whoops, pressing that. This is what Ansel had to say about it. He said that he was tired of Centaur. He didn't want to use it again. It had been used in too many of his books. He liked the typeface, but he just doesn't want to use it again, which was fine with me. So here's a comparison of what Centaur looks like and what Saban looks like, showing the difference, the feeling that it had in the book. Okay, well, when the book was published in September of '79, the September 3rd issue of Publishers Weekly had a large article about the book. There's the beginning page of it on the right. And one of the things that they focused on was the deluxe edition. And the deluxe edition was done the old-fashioned way. Because it was such a large book, we didn't want it to separate from the spine because of its weight. So it was sewed on cords, the old-fashioned way. And this was done by my wife, Carolyn, Carolyn, who had come with me to meet Ansel and Virginia at their home in Carmel, and now was in charge of the deluxe binding. Carolyn learned the craft from Arno Werner, who trained many of the top hand bookbinders that were working in New England. And there is Carolyn on the left, looking over Arno's shoulder. And this is the photograph that was the basis for the poster that I did as a tribute to Arno back in 1984. I took photographs of the work she was doing. She was working with her partner, Nancy Southworth, the Coleman and Southworth bindery in Lancaster, New Hampshire, where we were living at the time. So these are photographs showing some of the steps in making the binding. Those are the cords you see on the left, and on the right is the book press where threads are used to help create the definition on the edges of the cords where they pop, where they they affect these bumps in the spine. And this is what the final result looks like. They also made these tray cases. Quite a wonderful, wonderful project they did. So that was Yosemite in the Range of Light. And there were going to be other Ansel Adams books that I would design, and they would also have to have titling and text faces. So just as a review, here is again the titling of Steve Harvard and the Yosemite and Yosemite set in Saban. That was the combination for Yosemite in the Range of Light. So in 2007, when I was brought back to work on a new series of Ansel's books, I chose my own typeface, Penumbra, for the titling, and Magma by Sumner Stone as the text face. And there's an interesting story about how this combination came about. Sumner was the director of type development at Adobe Systems. He first invited me to visit back there in 1987. When I first went to Adobe in Palo Alto, they only had 60 employees. That was it. Very early days. So he wanted to have a type advisory board that would help give credibility to his plans, to help convince the managers that the directions that he wanted to go in were credible. If he could get a group of experts from around the country to back him up. So he chose Stephen Harvard, you see there on the far right. And next to Sumner is Roger Black, and then there's me, and then Jack Stoffaker. Alvin Eisenman was part of this group, but he wasn't able to be there the day that this photograph was taken. And during this time of the type board, I was starting to develop my career as a poster artist, and I was doing my own lettering, and I was floundering around doing sort of traditional Roman letters that looked like type, or trying on the far right there some lettering that was based on Futura typeface. And I wasn't happy with any of it. I was really not sure what direction to go. And I was thinking I wanted to do something like a sans serif, but when I looked at the models that were out there in the world of typography, Gil Sans was a nice humanistic sans serif that I liked very much, and there was also the wonderful geometry of Futura. But both of these typefaces were too much identified with their designers, Eric Gill and Paul Renner, and they seemed to feel like they came from a different time and a different place, and they weren't right for what I was doing in my posters. So I talked to Steve Harvard about this problem. He was living not far from me up in Lancaster, where we talked about what would be the ideal sans serif, and we both thought it would be something that would perhaps have some of Optima's qualities, you know, the swelled strokes, you know, those vertical stems that swell a little bit toward the ending, but would have the uniform stroke weights of traditional sans serifs like Gill. But we have never seen a typeface like that. So I commissioned Steve to give it a shot, to try it out for one of my upcoming posters, which was this one, the poster that was a 10th anniversary poster for David Godine, a company that I had helped start back in 1970. And Stephen did this lettering. It's pretty rough, but he knew I was going to be tracing it and cutting it with an X-Acto knife to make the stencil, because I was doing this silkscreen printing myself at home. But this was the first thing that I had seen that was getting into the area of a sans serif with swelled strokes. I also decided that I didn't want to use upper and lowercase. It was too busy. So as I started to do more posters, I did them in all capitals, but I experimented now with this idea of having the strokes not be perfectly straight on the sides, having a little bit of a curve. And this is how it was developing. Another Godine poster, Godine for Children. And out of this work, which was happening while I've been doing this work prior to the Adobe Typeboard. And once I got into the Adobe Typeboard, Sumner and others thought that my experiments in poster lettering might make a good typeface. And the result was Penumbra, which was issued by Adobe in 1994. And I have then been using it on all my posters. It's a family of 16 fonts. Each one has each different serif option has 4 different weights, as you can see. Then, almost 10 years, or almost 20 years later, no, 10 years later, in 2003, Sumner came out with Magma. And when I saw Magma, I was so excited because it had this qualities that Stephen and I had been talking about, and that Stephen had tried to develop in the poster that his lettering was commissioned for. So here you see a comparison of Steve's lettering on top and Sumner's typeface on the bottom. Sumner's typeface is by no means a copy of what Steve was doing. It was just an idea that was in the air, and this was Sumner's wonderful interpretation of how to do it. So, Penumbra and Magma. When I was commissioned to create this book, do the design of the cover and the interior, I did not know that it was going to be a rebranding of a series. And in fact, I don't think the people at Little Brown were actually sure that's what it was going to be either, but that's how it turned out. So the typeface that I used for the title, you see here, is the flare serif version of Penumbra in the lightest weight. And here is Magma. Now it's Magma 2. It's an updated version of Magma. These are the 2 typefaces of the new series. And one of the features of the typography in the 400 photographs book is that it was large. The text face is 13:17. And you can see on the right a more typical text is 10-point Baskerville from the new book, wonderful, wonderful book just out from the Yale University Press, Making a Photographer, the early work of Ansel Adams. I recommend this book to everybody. But for people like myself who have some visual disability, it's difficult to read 10-point Baskerville. And Bill Turnage, who was overseeing these Little Brown books, he was the director of the Ansel Adams Publishing Right Trust, and he had a great interest in all of the books, and he had his hand in everything in the most wonderful way. He was grateful to have the large 13-point type because he was slowly going blind. He had severe vision disability. So he was totally in favor of the 13-point type. This is an attempt to explain another reason why I think the sans serif types like Magma are desirable for a text setting. And it's because like 70% of the population has some degree of astigmatism. I've had severe astigmatism ever since I was born, and I've always gravitated towards sans serif types, and I was not really sure why that was, but I found them easier to read. There was less eye strain. And as I started getting treatments, and I even had some eye surgery and talking to ophthalmologists about astigmatism, I said, you know, I sometimes see something like a drop shadow, and they said, oh yeah, we call that the ghost image. And I said, is that common? And they said, yes, many people with astigmatism see a ghost image, even if they have if they're looking with only one eye, if the other eye is closed. It's not double vision. It's a ghost image that is the result of the eyeball not being perfectly spherical. So I started paying more attention to this ghost image, and it changes depending upon how tired my eyes are, whether I'm reading on a backlit screen or whether I'm reading on a book. And what I found was that typefaces that have serifs and tapering, so contrast between thin and thick strokes, have a lot more visual noise, and I would get eye strain much sooner, and I could not read for as long if a book was set in a traditional text face, like the Minion example I show on the bottom there. And I tried to give a kind of example of what this ghost image effect looks like. It's hard to get it exactly right because it changes, as I said. But you can see, oops, sorry about that. Yeah, up there in the example with magma, the letters look simpler, and it's because they have uniform weight, and the shadow just seems to like be a reinforcement of the strokes. Whereas with a Minion, you see little white spaces in between the ghost image and the black type. It's just much more visual noise, which does not make it easy. It causes eye strain. So I know there's type designers and typographers have pretty strong opinions about whether to use sans serifs for text face. And I worked in the disability services office at the college near my home for a number of years, and became much more aware of how many people have vision impairments who don't have correct prescriptions in their lenses, don't have very good lighting at home, all sorts of problems. And this is one reason why the companies that produce interfaces and operating systems of computers have now only used sans serif types, because they know that overall it's much more legible for a broad spectrum of readers. So that's why I use sans serif, and I like magma because of the curves in it. It looks a little bit alive. It looks like there was a person that made it. So this is a comment that Michael Sand, who was the editor at Little Brown during the first years when we were producing this new look for the books, it really struck a chord with everybody. As he said, it was both timeless and contemporary, which is just what they wanted for Ansel. Here is Michael Sand. He's one of the best editors that any designer would ever hope to work for, especially on visual books. He had a great interest, and he's now the publisher at Abrams. He moved over there from Little Brown. But he had not only a great eye for the visual part, for the pictorial part of the books, but he also had a great eye for typography. And I can say of the many books that I worked on with him, I never argued with him about any comment he made about the type in the books. He was infallible. He was a great partner to work with on these books. So this is an example of what a spread looks like. This was a little later on, another one of books edited by Andrea Stillman. It was so wonderful to keep working with her. After our first encounter working on Yosemite and the Range of Light, we got to continue to develop our collaboration with these books. And this was one of what a text opener looked like. And here is zoomed in on that page so you can actually see the texture of the type. And for people who are not used to looking at sans serifs for text type, that must seem a little strange, but this is what we decided on, and it's been very successful. So here's Andrea again, and the three most important books that she produced. The first two she was the editor for, and a lot of the work that she and I did was the sequencing of the images. And we talked during those days about how we sequenced, or how I sequenced Yosemite in the Range of Light, and that musical metaphor. And we tried to do that again in the 400 photographs in the national parks. We were thinking of pairings of images and a musical flow in the book. And then the one she wrote herself, which is an artistic biography. She was a trained photography historian who had worked at the Metropolitan Museum of Art print department, where Ansel stole her away to bring her back to California to work with him. So she gives a perspective both of an art historian and also as a person who knew Ansel very well from being his assistant and knew his work very well. So it's a wonderful artist biography. And of course, Bill Turnage, who we all got to know because of his enthusiasm for our work and his deep interest and his praise of it. And if he didn't like something, he was also quite clear about that with all of us. But he was a very close friend to Ansel and did a lot to help Ansel in his later years. And he was a great environmentalist too. That was the thing that the two men had in common. One of the other fascinating aspects of Ansel's 400 photographs was that it inspired Dave Brubeck and his son Chris to compose a symphonic music. And here is the album cover. Dave Brubeck was so moved by the photographs, and is it just a coincidence that he was reading them as he was seeing them musically? He was thinking of music as he looked at the spreads and went flowing through the books, through the 400 photographs book in particular. And I'm sure that Ansel would have been pleased as a musician himself that another great musician and his son had that kind of response. Well, the branding sample that we set up with Ansel Adams' 400 photographs then was adopted and carried on through this whole series of books, more or less, a few changes here and there. And down at the bottom, you see some books where just the covers and the title page were redesigned in the new series format. The new editor who took the place of Michael Sand at Little Brown is Mike Gerban, you see there on the left. And after Bill Turnage died and the Ansel Adams Publishing Right Trust was handed over to be managed by Claudia Rice, who I worked with on her book about the special edition prints of Yosemite. And here we are at the Museum of Fine Arts with Karen Haas, the Lane curator of photographs at the museum, who was the curator for Ansel Adams in Our Time, this extraordinarily interesting exhibit that is now traveling around the United States. I think right now it's in Portland, Oregon. And you can see the whole thing online, and it has video elements in it as well. It's a wonderful, wonderful exhibition. And on the right is Sandra Klint, my dear colleague who I have worked with on so many books and who is such a perfectionist and is always watching my back and helping me avoid dire problems that would pass by me, except for her sharp eye. She's one of the best. And she also had background working at the Steinauer Press. We had that in common from long ago. So one of the issues of redesigning some of these backlist books is that the original books were designed by friends of mine. And in this case, Dean Bornstein designed the original edition of the Grand Canyon in the Southwest, which is an exquisite cover. I mean, it's just a perfect cover. Everything about it, I love. The Dante type, the color of the background, that black rule over Ansel's name, the beautiful photograph bleeding, that is just perfection. So I had this assignment to redesign it to look like the new series, and here it is. So I called Dean and I told him. He was not aware that this had happened, and he was very gracious about it. he could not have felt good about it, but he was totally a gentleman about it. And if you're watching, Dean, I thank you for that very much. But anyway, I hope I did your book justice under the circumstances. The inside of the book that Dean designed is still untouched and is still as beautiful as ever. One interesting spin-off from all of this work was that the Michael Peach and others at Little Brown were interested in Sumner Stone's Magma. And they also were getting tired of their old logo for Little Brown. So they commissioned me to design, to do a rebranding for Little Brown, which I did. And this was the final logo. And they agreed they wanted Magma to be the new corporate typefaces on all of their business cards and stationery and other documents, which was a great reinforcement of the wisdom of our choice, somewhat unorthodox choice of using Magma for this important series of books. And here at the end of the show, I want to give an appreciation to Mary Street Allender, not only for her helping Ansel during his last years with his autobiography as his kind of secretary and editor. Did a beautiful job, and the book was designed by Susan Marsh, one of the best book designers in the world, who was right here in Massachusetts. And Mary later went on to write this book, Group F64, which is, for anybody who's interested in the history of 20th century photography, this book you have to read. This group of people led by Edward Weston, Ansel Adams, and Imogen Cunningham, who transformed the way photographers thought about the art. And then her wonderful biography of Ansel, which is a result of her thorough combing through vast amounts of correspondence and other archives saved by his family. So wonderful books by Mary Allender. I couldn't help putting this in. You know, we're just, 8 more years away from the 50th anniversary of Yosemite and the Range of Light. Michael Sand had told me that there had been discussions about whether this would ever be reprinted. So if it helps, if there's any interest in doing it, 2029 would be a great occasion to bring out a reprint of it. It was a book that Ansel said that he liked best of all the books he had done. Mary Allender also said that during his first 5 years, this very expensive book, both hardcover and softcover, sold 250,000 copies. That's 250,000 copies, which probably makes it second only to The Family of Man. It was published by the Museum of Modern Art. So it was an important book. It was Ansel's last book and one of the most successful art books ever published. So I'll finish again with this, my favorite portrait of Ansel. And a lot of us feel gratitude for his vast amount of energy and the things that he left behind that have given us so much to think about, and also to help us make a living, to help keep the work out in front of the public. So I think a lot of people would join me in saying, thank you, Ansel. And with that, I close my show. Thank you very much.
Well,